On primetime politics tonight, MPs spend much of the day in the House on an opposition motion calling on the federal government to deliver a plan to lift all vaccine mandates. As Conservatives change course and call for an end to the blockades, MPs will be here to debate that and the push to investigate the foreign funding of the ongoing protests. One of those protests at the busiest border crossing is hobbling Canada's supply chain and shutting down operations for Canadian automakers. I'll speak with this auto parts executive about the damage being done and how to stop it. And our panel of political commentators on how our leaders are handling the protests and the pandemic response. Well, it is another day of disruptive and divisive protests against vaccine mandates and another day of debate on Parliament Hill about how to bring them to an end. MPs debated a Conservative motion calling on the Liberal government to put forward a plan before the end of the month to end all federal vaccine mandates and restrictions. The interim Conservative leader, Candice Bergen, who has supported the protesters, changed course today, calling for an end to the blockades and barricades in Ottawa and at border crossings in Windsor, Ontario, in Alberta and in Manitoba now. In the daily question period, the debate flared again over calls for a plan to end the federal mandates.
It's been almost 2 weeks since the beginning of this impasse. We all want the protests to end and these Canadians to feel like they've been heard and respected. But now critical infrastructure is being restricted. Why? Because of this Prime Minister's failure. I've asked the Prime Minister to meet with me and the other opposition leaders in good faith to try to find a way forward from this impasse. He didn't answer yesterday. He hasn't answered to date. I'm going to ask him again. Will he meet with us?
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada has spent the last 2 weeks endorsing and enabling these blockades across the country. The leader of the Conservative Party and her team have been their biggest champions, even promoting their fundraising. The consequences of these actions are having dire impacts. They're impacting trade, they're hurting jobs, they're threatening our economy, and they're obstructing our communities. I am focused on ending it. I hope the Leader of the Opposition will maintain her current position and continue to call for an end to these blockades.
Well, let's bring in three members of Parliament now to discuss the latest developments on the response to the blockades on a day when the Commons Public Safety Committee begins its study into the funding, including foreign funding, of the ongoing protests in Canada. Taleeb Noormohamed is a British Columbia Liberal MP and a member of the Public Safety Committee. Dr. Stephen Ellis is a Nova Scotia Conservative MP. And Alistair MacGregor is the Public Safety Critic for the NDP, also a member of the committee, and he is also a British Columbia MP. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Mr. Noormohamed, look, I'll get to the investigation at committee into foreign interference in the Canadian protests in a minute, but let me start with the debate in the House today on the call for a plan from the Prime Minister by the end of this month for lifting all federal pandemic mandates. Will your party support that motion?
I think our party is going to support the science, and we need to be guided by science. We cannot be making decisions on the back of what crowds want us to be doing. This is about making decisions that's based on science. We're going to do what public health experts tell us to do, as we have done for the last 2 years. And that's what's gotten Canada to be in the state that we are, which is one of the...
So is that to say that there isn't enough science in front of you, you believe, to present a plan for when, a timetable for when restrictions might be lifted?
I mean, I think anyone who reasonably can predict exactly what is going to happen with variants and how those variants will respond and react deserves the Nobel Prize right now, because I think we have to follow the science and make the right decisions. Okay. And so it's impossible to say we're going to have a plan on this day and that day without actually understanding all of the facts that are at play.
Okay, let me move to your colleagues here. Stephen Ellis, I want you to weigh in on that and where we are in the science as it relates to federal mandates. I also want you to talk to me about your interim leader, Candice Bergen, had previously said Conservatives shouldn't press for protesters to leave because they were creating a problem for Justin Trudeau. But today she's asking the protesters to do just that, to end their protest. What's changed?
Thanks for having me here, Peter. I think it's really, really important that Canadians begin to understand that this is a failure of Liberal leadership. Once again, we've seen this for the last 2 years. They have no plan. They have never had a plan. They're always too little, too late, not at the right time. And again, Sadly, what we continue to see is the spin doctors not listening to real doctors and how they need to at least have a plan in moving forward. Canadians are beginning to lose hope here, sir. And I think that that is the most important narrative that Canadians want us politicians to understand and portray for them, that we need a plan going forward here to lift these federal mandates.
Why are Conservatives now telling protesters it's time to go home?
Well, I think, it's very, very clear. In the beginning, Canada's Conservatives are very, very supportive of people who have the right to peaceful protest and respectful protest. It's very, very clear also that when the protesters worked outside of those guidelines, Canada's Conservatives were quick to condemn them. And I also think that when protests become more than that and they're not serving a useful purpose, then Canada's Conservatives, who are the party of law and order, are going to step forward and say, hey, you know what, it's time to move on with this. You've made your point. We brought the Opposition Day motion forward now to end mandates.
Mr. MacGregor, your leader called on the Prime Minister to show leadership to end the protest, but wasn't quite specific on exactly what should happen. He did say we should call in the U.S. ambassador to answer questions about foreign funding. But what more should the Prime Minister be doing, and where does the NDP stand on this motion?
Well, the Prime Minister is showing a lack of leadership on this issue. And, the situation has gotten worse, going all the way back to the election when vaccinations were politicized. And, we used to be in a state in this country in 2021 where we were all in this together. And then the issue of vaccinations got politicized. In terms of leadership, we now have a situation where 2-3 major border crossings going into the United States are being blockaded by protesters. This is clear federal jurisdiction. We need the federal government to step up, show leadership. And the reason why is because we have so many workers and so many businesses that are suffering from this. The irony is that these anti-lockdown protests are now themselves causing lockdowns. And so Canadians are stuck between the lack of leadership from the federal Liberals and the Conservatives who are playing footsie with all of the extremists who are causing all these lockdowns. It's an extremely frustrating position to be in.
All right. Mr. Noormohamed, let me talk about the protests. And the specific focus began in hearings today looking into millions of dollars raised for the protesters through crowdsourcing platforms. A lot of money is coming from outside Canada, that's clear, including from U.S. donors. You also successfully expanded the study to look into the funding of extremist groups. So what are you after with this study?
It's important for Canadians who are giving to good causes to be able to know that they can contribute to the causes that they believe in. But there is a line, right? And I think that line is when foreign actors start to fund things that disrupt, that cause extremist-based violence in Canada, that promote hate in Canada. We have to stand up to stop that. And I think it's particularly important given, we saw Conservatives over the course of the last 2 weeks, as Mr. MacGregor said, play footsie with some incredibly bad elements. They had no problem, even after there were swastikas, even after there were Confederate flags, continuing to have coffee with these folks, continue to engage with them. So it's time for us to step up and say, look, there is no room for this in Canada. And if foreign actors are going to be funding stuff like this, we've got to put a stop to it.
Dr. Ellis, you weren't at the committee. You're not on that committee, but I know I think you've been briefed on what sort of went on there. But I can tell you I watched it. The GoFundMe officials will appear before that committee on March 3rd. They collected $10 million before they shut down the fundraiser. But the protesters are now raising millions more from other crowdsourcing platforms. But I heard officials from FinTrack, Canada's financial intelligence unit, say today that so far they've seen nothing suspicious or worrisome in the fundraising for these protests. So what do you want to know about where the money's coming from?
I think there's a couple of things here that are really important. My colleagues continue to use this disparaging and inflammatory language, which is not really settling down the whole issue. And I really want to call people out on that. That's what the Prime Minister has done that's really created part of this problem. And that's unfortunate that my colleagues want to pick up and use that same style of language. Secondly, I think that what Canadians want to see is transparency in the processes. So bringing the GoFundMe people in front of the committee, I think that makes perfect sense because if this government wants to continue to act it the way they are now, it's unlikely that this will be the end of protests and the end of funding of many groups to come. Because quite frankly, sir, Canadians are fed up with the style of leadership, lack of leadership, let's be honest, that continues here, and the division of Canadians, which is really not a way to lead a country. It's not the way to lead a business. It's not the way to lead anything. A hockey team.
Mr. MacGregor, you heard from officials from FinTrack today. Are you satisfied that mechanisms are in place to track suspicious contributions? They said so far they haven't seen anything that worries them to this point. Are you convinced any laws have actually been broken by those foreigners who are supporting the protests?
I think FinTrack laid the table nicely for the start of this study. Let's not forget that in April of last year, another crowdfunding site, Give, Send, Go, a data breach occurred. It was found that they were funneling money towards groups like the Proud Boys. So I think we need to explore this. That's why I brought forward the original motion last week. It's why Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, brought forward an emergency debate motion in the House of Commons, why my colleague Heather McPherson is working at the Foreign Affairs Committee to call the United States ambassador. We have serious questions about this. And in terms of inflammatory language, you need look no further than some of the convoy organizers about some of the extremism that they're supporting. We have very serious concerns about American donations.
Just hang on a second, Dr. Ellis. Just hang on. Let him finish his point. Then. Hang on. Let him finish. Go ahead, Mr. MacGregor.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know a lot of the donations are coming from the same people in the United States who thought that January 6th was legitimate political discourse. I don't think Canadians want that type of rhetoric or political leaning coming into our country.
But have they broken the law? The laws in this country prohibit outside sources from putting funds into election campaigns and so on. But
that's precisely what our parliamentary committee will be investigating. We owe it to ourselves, to Canadians as policymakers, to ensure that any gaps that exist in the legislation are filled.
Okay, Dr. Ellis, let me hear you want to jump in.
You know, I think what's important here is what I'm trying to understand is why my colleagues want to continue to be inflammatory with respect to this and how the words that they choose, not the words that protesters want to use. Canadians do have freedom of expression and free speech. I think that's important. I just can't understand.
But Dr. Ellis, if there were
continue to be inflammatory,
Dr. Ellis,
they want to say and the words they choose.
If there are groups that are connected to the January 6th events in the United States that help fund that, if they are funding protests in Canada, would you want to know that?
Peter, what I'm actually calling out is the colleagues and their style of language. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that they want to be inflammatory here. Of course, why would Canadians not want to know who is funding this and to be transparent in our government? What I'm calling out of my colleagues is the disparaging and divisive language that's been brought forward here on the show, and sadly continues to be used by the Prime Minister as he refused to do anything to bring Canadians together, show real leadership, and allow these things to be finished.
Mr. Noormohamed, I got a quick a few seconds here for a final comment from you.
You know, this is exactly what you're seeing. This is precisely how the Conservatives continue to gaslight Canadians. These are folks that the Conservatives have had no problem at all playing this when it's convenient for them, and as soon as their internal polling shows that Canadians don't like what is happening in Ottawa, they don't like what these protests stands for, all of a sudden they change their tune. They have not been interested in doing anything at all to bring Canadians together.
That's our time. That's our time. Listen, gentlemen, I wish we had more time to continue the conversation. We'll have another chance, but I thank you all for joining me to talk about it tonight. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Let's turn now to perhaps the most damaging protest in the country. The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor continues for a fourth day. Auto groups and the city are going to court to try to obtain an injunction to end the blockade. This is the busiest border crossing in the country. More than $300 million a day worth of trade goes back and forth across that bridge each day. It's a vital supply line for manufacturing and food between Canada and the United States. And protesters who want an end to vaccine mandates have shut it down, along mostly with the second international bridge in Sarnia as well. Auto plants on both sides of the border are now being idled and workers are being sent home. And if this lasts much longer, there could be long-lasting effects on the auto industry in Canada. Flavio Volpe is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. He's with me now. Mr. Volpe, good to see you. Thanks for taking time to speak with me today. What can you tell us about the impact these protests at Windsor and to a slightly lesser extent at Sarnia are now having on the auto industry?
Well, there's about 100,000 people that show up to work to make parts every day in Ontario. There's at least that many in Michigan. And there's about 40,000 people that make cars in Ontario and probably twice that in Michigan. Today, all of those people are standing idle because 30 pickup trucks and a Hyundai Tucson are sitting on the access point on the Canadian side. It is not a trucker protest. I think we've watched this over the last few days turn into kind of an anti-government protest, but just sitting in the middle of the street. And what it's doing is costing about $600 million so far in goods that either didn't get made or didn't get shipped, and every day that passes is another $300 million.
I'm not sure everyone knows just how fragile the supply lines already are because of the pandemic, and then add the impact of the protest to that. Explain the effect of just a day or two delay in being able to move auto parts back and forth across the border.
This is a very lean industry. We operate in a just-in-time principle, meaning that if you're making a pickup truck in Jefferson County, Michigan, and you're getting seats from a factory in London, Ontario, they need 1,000 seats today to make 500 cars. And if they don't get them, they won't make those cars. And if they don't make those cars, every other supplier, whether that's Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Ontario, Quebec, also has to stand down on that production line. Well, multiply that by about 20 production lines on either side of the border, and probably 3,000 parts factories and a few hundred tool suppliers. And if you stick your finger into the bridge like this group has and said, you can't pass by here, there isn't another place to do it. You can't use the tunnel. And we went to Sarnia. Yeah. But, you can't send that many through Sarnia, so everybody's standing down.
We are now already seeing some U.S. politicians pointing to the bridge closures to fuel the Buy American debate again and calling for repatriating all auto production to the U.S. How concerned are you about where this could go?
I'm very concerned. I just came back from Washington last week, working on a compromise position on the Buy American piece and that EV tax credit that is would hurt Canadian vehicle production. And now we're giving everybody an opportunity to show them that, look, maybe the best way to secure your supply is to make sure that it's in Michigan rather than Ontario. The people that are on this bridge, you're looking at the shot here of trucks. Those aren't protesters. They're being blocked by the people at the front. I've said there's a few dozen people there that should just be embarrassed. You've ground your city to a halt. And you're saying to them, look, we're fighting for your freedom. Look, they have freedom to drive those trucks and to make the parts that go over there. And I'll tell you that the lasting impression here will be is people like me and people in government are going to have to continue to talk to Washington and to Paris and to Tokyo and all the other auto capitals of the world to make the decisions, because we don't have a car maker that is Canadian, and say, no, this couldn't happen again. But frankly, feels like a Simpsons episode. Just looking at your shot here, these people shut down the country.
What's your assessment of how our political leaders have handled all of this?
I think initially I said, I lived through 1995 in Ipperwash. You can't have politicians directing law enforcement. But frankly, I think law enforcement is being a little bit too careful here. And they're not paid to understand the wider implications. I think bipartisan, tripartisan, tri-level leadership resolve, standing out there and saying we want to do this, we need to get this cleared, is required. And some political leadership on both sides, the opposition parties at both levels, some of them have encouraged these protesters to be lawless. Somebody running to be the Prime Minister of Canada, I guess we've got a new system here, has said these people are fighting for your freedom. I think these people should be embarrassed that we're even having this conversation and this interview, Peter. I will have to explain this away for the rest of my career. And everybody else who tries to get foreign direct investment into Canada will have to explain why somebody should put a $2 billion asset on this side of the border, send $10 billion worth of cars to that side of the border, when, just a bunch of guys with hockey sticks and barbecues can shut it all down.
All right. Flavio Volpe, thank you for your perspective tonight. Good to talk to you. Take care.
My pleasure.
I want to bring in our panel of political commentators now. Susan Smith is a Liberal commentator, Andrea Van Vugt is a Conservative commentator, and Kim Wright is an NDP commentator. Good to see you all. Let's talk about leadership as we watch what's unfolding in the country. Susan, let me start with you. Everyone in the country is watching these protests, wondering about the leadership required to return order to the streets and to reopen international border crossings. What more can the Prime Minister, what more should the Prime Minister be doing right now to bring these protests to an end?
Well, Peter, there are a number of things that need to happen at the leadership on multiple levels. And I think the first is in my opinion, there was a failure of leadership at the police level municipally in Ottawa that enabled this all to happen. We all know we can't get on Parliament Hill on Canada Day. You can't get near it. You can't get near the Cenotaph on Remembrance Day. So there was a failure of leadership, I think, at the municipal level, and there'll be lots of investigation into that after. I think now all levels of government are engaged, though I'm hearing that Doug Ford is still not engaging, at least at the trilateral table with the feds in the province, or his ministers may be engaging, but at the highest level in the Ontario level, where the jurisdiction is for the removal of mask mandates and the removal of mandates of groupings that these occupiers are asking for.
Right.
He's not at the table.
He's making the case. Look, this is a local policing matter. Let the local police take care of it.
Well, it is a local policing matter, but it's bigger than that now. You know, I walked down the street today, and I was speaking with some of the people, and there was one guy who was basically insinuating that there were awful and worse things that were going to happen. When you have 140,000 plus auto workers, plus all the ancillary factories and things that can't work because of these truckers' blockades, that's beyond a municipal policing matter. The province needs to get involved as well. But I don't think the province or the federal government should be making public health decisions based on bullying. That
okay, so the way you're okay with the way the Prime Minister's he's done what you think the Prime Minister has been able.
No, I think I would have liked to see Minister Mendicino and Minister Blair out sooner. I think and they have been the faces and voices. The Prime Minister has been in question period. He's responded to media questions. Like I said, I don't think responding to bullying is the way to deal with things. So I think the government is doing what it's doing, but most of it is behind the scenes.
All right. I want to hear you on that, Andrea, and as well in this context. The Conservatives backed the protests initially, and now they're calling for an end to them. So tell me how Conservatives are showing leadership on this issue.
I think I agree with a lot of what Susan has said. I think that the failure at multiple levels of government, the municipality, the police service, the provincial government, the federal government, politicians, to help take the heat out of the convoys, which has simply led to an increase in the number of convoys really across the country, that's creating not only an international trade problem, but also a bit of an international relations problem. We see the governor of Michigan out today, ironically asking us to open our border when we have our own border crossing issues with Michigan. But I think, this is a complicated problem that, started as part of the mandate, the vaccine mandate for truckers crossing the border. But I think what it's evolved into now is more of a protest against COVID, the pandemic, the restrictions that have been imposed by, all of the provinces and the federal government. It's a bit of a statement against the frustration and challenge.
Fair enough, but that was evident early on in the protest in Ottawa. There was more than a truckers' protest, and I guess I'm wondering whether Conservatives need to acknowledge that to some measure their support for the protest enabled the protest to continue.
I don't believe that the Conservative support for the protest led the convoy to continue or inflamed it. I really don't.
All right, Kim, let me hear from you on this.
Well, I appreciate Andrea thinking that, but the reality is the Conservatives have been sucking and blowing on these convoys from the beginning. And that's been evidence for the last week. Aaron O'Toole loses his job. Candice Bergen comes in. They go have peace with the protesters. Andrew Scheer goes out, takes some pictures. It's all sorts of sucking and blowing. So here we are. The police in Ottawa did not believe that this was going to be a thing, and it is clearly a thing. Last weekend, the city of Toronto as really went in and said to the protesters, you are not going to come into the city and wreak havoc the way you did in the city of Ottawa. That has been where you see in Toronto really got a hold of the demonstrations, gave them their space to protest, but then also moved it along. We didn't see this in Windsor. it got its own feet under it at the Ambassador Bridge, and that is going to be really difficult and challenging to get out of this. And so ultimately, yes, there is provincial responsibility. Doug Ford has a whole series of highways and an entire police force that should be at the table talking about how we deal with these protesters. He's not there. But this really does need to be a tripartite response, and really everyone needs to get on the same page.
Susan, the Prime Minister today again rejected requests from opposition leaders to have a meeting with them to try and look for solutions. He's being pressed again to provide a timetable for lifting vaccine mandates, even from a couple of his own MPs. And I guess here's the question. Are we just going to see this unrest in the land continue? Because here's what... I mean, it's a question of sort of reading the room, I guess. Here you have a Prime Minister being pressed to give us a timetable for when at least the mandates he's responsible for federally are going to disappear. And that's against a backdrop of all kinds of other provinces opening up. So people are enjoying freedoms in different parts of the country while a federal government is still preaching caution and restraint. So how does that message get through that the Prime Minister is sticking to in the face of what's happening in other parts of the country?
Peter, let's remember throughout the pandemic that it was up to every province to impose the jurisdictional restrictions that met their public health issues or realities and the data and the science that was available. That was never the Prime Minister telling Alberta what to do or telling PEI what to do or telling Scott Moe what to do. Each of those premiers have always done their own things. We saw what happened when Jason Kenney threw open Alberta in time for Stampede, right? They got whacked right back. So the Prime Minister isn't now all of a sudden going to step into provincial jurisdiction. I heard the Public Health Officer for Ontario say today they're looking at the data, they're looking at where the trends are going, and they're going to make public health decisions based on the science.
Okay, Andrea, let me hear you on that. Everybody claims to be following the advice of the health experts, and when the premiers are doing it in many of the provinces, the advice they're seeing is to say, let's open up and lift restrictions, and maybe it's a different message at the federal level.
Yeah, I just want to address the comment earlier. I think it's a bit naive to think that if the Conservatives had not expressed some interest in willing to talk to and meet with the convoy participants, that they would be gone now, right? Like, that's not why this has continued. It's continued because the folks that are still, occupying Ottawa and the Ambassador Bridge and the Coutts Land border and the border between Manitoba and the United States, they're there because they feel as though they're not getting hurt. And what's ironic, actually, is that given all of the protests are occurring at the same time that provincial governments are starting to actually loosen some of the restrictions. And so in that context, you wonder, at what point, at what plan does the Prime Minister, the federal government, and the health experts have for loosening or lifting some of those restrictions? And I think laying out some sort of a plan, some sort of a vision for the future would take a lot of the air out of the frustration of lots of folks that are saying we need to move on.
Okay, Kim, Wright, let me hear a final comment from you on that. Is it reasonable to expect the Prime Minister to put some sort of plan timetable for lifting the federal mandates?
I think everybody has looked for that since the beginning of the pandemic. This has been a communications failure of epic proportions at every level of government across the country all throughout the pandemic. That being said, they also have to be very careful about being, embracing this sort of mob mentality. And Premier John Horgan of British Columbia yesterday did a press conference saying, look, we're not going to make public health decisions based on honking of horns in front of the legislature. That's not how this is going to work. So there does need to be a better approach to this. There needs to be more transparency of how decisions are being made. And ultimately, these Scott Moe's going to now lift these restrictions, or Jason Kenney is, or what have you, without any backing up of evidence of why they're doing it, is just as foolish as putting in restrictions without evidence in the first place. But they're really going to have to wrap their hands around this, because ultimately we're going to keep seeing these types of convoys if they think that this will be the way to move government policy.
All right, we'll leave it at that for our conversation today. Thank you all. Good to talk to you all, and we'll talk again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's our time tonight for another edition of Primetime Politics. From all of us here at CPAC, I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching. Until next time.